In 1876, Wyatt Earp's revolver fell out of its holster in a Wichita saloon. It hit the floor. It fired. The bullet went through his coat and into the ceiling. Nobody was hurt. That time. Now here is what you need to understand about that story. This was not some rookie mistake. This was Wyatt Earp, one of the most celebrated gunfighters in American history, a man whose name became synonymous with fast draws and deadly accuracy. And his loaded revolver went off by itself when it fell 3 feet onto a wooden floor. That one incident tells you more about real gunfighting on the Wild West frontier than 2 hours of any Hollywood film ever could. Because the reality of how cowboys and lawmen actually handled firearms, the techniques they used, the limitations they worked around, the dangers they faced from their own weapons, is almost completely opposite to what you have seen on screen. There was no fanning the hammer and a blur of motion. There was no hip shooting while walking down a dusty street. There was no low-slung holster tied to the thigh. Almost none of it was real. And what was real is far more interesting and far more dangerous than the fantasy. Welcome to the Western Archive, the channel dedicated to putting the documented historical record up against the mythology of the American West and seeing what survives. Now let's get into what shooting on the frontier actually looked like. Before we talk about technique, we need to talk about the tool. Because the single biggest misconception about gunfighting on the Wild West frontier is which weapons serious men actually relied on. The answer is not the revolver. For any engagement where a man had advance notice, any situation where violence was anticipated rather than sudden, the weapon of choice was a long gun. A Winchester lever-action repeating rifle, or more commonly, a double-barreled shotgun loaded with buckshot. The reasons are straightforward and have nothing to do with romance. A rifle or shotgun is easier to aim accurately, particularly under stress. It delivers dramatically more stopping power at practical distances, and with a shotgun especially, the spread of the shot compensates for the trembling hands, elevated heart rate, and compromised vision that accompany actual life-or-death confrontations. The revolver, the Colt single-action army, the Smith & Wesson top break, whatever a man carried on his hip, was what historians and contemporary professionals called a weapon of last resort. You reached for it when the rifle was not in your hands, when the situation had deteriorated faster than you anticipated, when you were already in the room with the problem and there was no time to do anything else. Wyatt Earp was explicit about this in interviews and documented conversations. So was Doc Holliday, who was famously carrying a shotgun at the gunfight at the OK Corral, not a pistol. So were virtually every lawman and professional gunfighter whose preferences are recorded. Hollywood gave you the revolver because a shotgun is not cinematic in the same way. A man standing sideways in a dusty street, hand hovering over a pistol, that is an image. A man walking into a room with a 10-gauge double barrel is just a man ending a problem efficiently. The movies needed the image. Reality needed the shotgun. The one-handed standard. Until well into the 20th century, the standard technique for pistol shooting was one-handed. One hand on the weapon, the other hand free, for the reins of a horse, for a saber, for balance, or simply because that was how it had always been done. The cultural tradition behind this is older than the American West. It traces directly to European dueling conventions and cavalry tactics, where the pistol was a secondary weapon carried in the hand that was not holding a saber or managing a horse. The word handgun itself, a gun operated by a single hand, encodes this assumption. Using your second hand to support the weapon was considered, in most professional circles, a sign of weakness or inexperience. The term that was sometimes used was unflattering. The assumption was that a competent man did not need assistance to hold and fire a pistol, and that needing assistance was an admission of inadequacy. This cultural attitude persisted long after the technical reasons for it had dissolved. The two-handed grip, the Weaver stance, the isosceles stance, did not become standard practice in American law enforcement or competitive shooting until the 1950s and 60s. For almost the entire history of the Wild West frontier, men shot with one hand. Period. The technical reason: no one wanted two hands near that cylinder. There was also a practical reason to keep your second hand away from the firearm, specifically away from the gap between the cylinder and the barrel. In the revolvers of the 1860s through 1880s, there was no gas seal between the front of the cylinder and the rear of the barrel. Every time the weapon fired, a jet of superheated gas, burning powder particles, and sometimes lead shavings escaped from that gap with considerable force. If your supporting hand was positioned anywhere near the cylinder, as a two-handed grip naturally places it, you were exposing your fingers to that blast. The documented injuries from this in period military records range from severe burns to partial finger amputations. It was not a theoretical risk. It was a documented recurring event. One-handed shooting kept all of your fingers safely behind the cylinder gap. It was not just tradition. It was the sensible response to a genuine mechanical hazard. The dueling stance. Side on to the threat. The standard combat stance of the era was side-facing, standing with the body turned roughly 90 degrees to the opponent, the shooting arm extended, the off shoulder turned away. The logic is simple. A human body viewed from the side presents roughly half the target area of the same body viewed from the front. In a confrontation where both parties are armed and accurate, reducing your visible profile is a meaningful survival advantage. This is why you occasionally see period photographs of frontier lawmen and competitive shooters in what looks like an awkward, stylized pose. They are not posing. They are demonstrating the stance they would use in a real confrontation. Point shooting, not looking down the sights. Here is something that will seem counterintuitive if your understanding of shooting comes entirely from modern firearms training. Most experienced frontier gunfighters did not use their sights in a close-quarters confrontation. The technique they used is called point shooting, or instinctive shooting. The idea is that at the distances where most real confrontations occurred, inside a saloon, across a card table, in a hotel corridor, the human visual system can direct a firearm onto a target without the conscious process of aligning front sight, rear sight, and target. The practical reasons for this are well documented. Under genuine mortal stress, the human body enters a state of arousal that narrows visual focus to the threat, not to the small metal post at the end of a gun barrel. The sights on a Colt single-action army were small, fixed, and difficult to acquire quickly under the best of conditions. Under stress, with hands shaking and vision tunneled, they were essentially useless. Professional shooters like Wyatt Earp articulated a philosophy that inverted what you might expect. "Take your time," he said, in various recorded statements. "Do not rush. One accurate shot to center mass matters more than 3 fast misses." The goal was not to be the first man to fire. The goal was to be the first man to hit. Fanning the hammer. Fanning, the technique of holding the trigger depressed and repeatedly slapping the hammer back with the palm of the free hand to fire rapidly, is one of the most iconic images in Western cinema. Characters fan their revolvers in nearly every gunfight from the 1930s onward. Real gunfighters considered it an embarrassment. The problem is mechanical. Fanning a single-action revolver removes your ability to control where the shots go. The weapon is cycling through its chambers faster than the human eye can track, faster than any practical aiming is possible, and the physical force of each slap introduces lateral movement into the gun itself. The documented accuracy of fanning a revolver at any target beyond arm's reach is essentially 0. The documented rate of mechanical damage to the revolver's timing and hand mechanism from fanning is high. Professional gunfighters knew both of these things. Fanning was a trick shooting technique. It appeared in Wild West shows, where the goal was spectacle rather than accuracy. It migrated from the show circuit into dime novels, and then into early cinema, where the visual effect of rapid fire was more valuable than historical accuracy. From cinema, it became the universal image of Western gunfighting. But in an actual confrontation, a man who fanned his revolver at you was either very close, very lucky, or very shortly to be shot by someone who took the time to aim. Hip shooting. Shooting from the hip, firing without raising the weapon above waist level, is similarly a cinematic invention that has almost no basis in documented frontier practice. The technique exists, it is acknowledged in period sources, but it is described in those same sources as useful only at extreme close range, inside a room, within a few feet of the target, and as producing results that were, even then, unreliable. Most professional accounts of the period describe raising the weapon to at least chest height before firing, and ideally to chin or eye level for any shot beyond conversational distance. The reason is physics. A firearm held at chest level has the shooter's entire upper body as a stabilizing platform. A firearm held at hip level has only the wrist and forearm. Hip shooting in the movies looks fast and fluid. In reality, it is a good way to miss someone who is actively trying to kill you, while also informing them with considerable clarity that you have discharged your weapon and need to manually cycle the action before you can fire again. The holster that never existed. The low-slung holster tied to the thigh, the so-called buscadero rig, with the holster hanging well below the hip and a leather thong securing it against the leg, is perhaps the most visually distinctive element of the Hollywood gunfighter's costume. It was invented in the 1950s by costume designers for movies. In the 19th century, men carried revolvers in holsters positioned high on the hip or waist. The reasons are entirely practical. A high holster is more stable when riding a horse. The weapon does not swing, bang against the saddle, or work itself loose during a gallop. A high holster is accessible to a hand that is naturally hanging at waist level. A high holster does not require the shooter to reach down and across his body to draw. Many experienced frontiermen preferred what is called a cross draw, the holster positioned on the opposite hip from the shooting hand, with the butt of the revolver facing forward. Drawing cross-body is slower than a same-side draw when standing, but it is considerably more natural and faster when seated, on a horse, in a saddle, or in a chair. For men who spent most of their working lives mounted or seated, this was a meaningful, practical advantage. The low-slung thigh holster was adopted by Hollywood because it looked dramatic on screen and allowed camera angles that showed both the actor's hand and the holster in the same shot. It has no documentary basis in the actual practice of the era. Here is a dimension of frontier gunfighting that almost never appears in any popular account, and that changes the entire picture once you understand it. Ammunition was expensive. Not inconvenient expensive, genuinely, prohibitively, life-altering expensive relative to what working men earned. A cowboy working a cattle drive in the 1870s earned approximately $1 per day, sometimes as little as $25 per month for a full season's work. A box of 1,000 centerfire cartridges for a standard revolver caliber cost $18 to $19 from a dry goods supplier. Think about what that means in practical terms. A box of 1,000 rounds cost the average working cowboy between 18 and 19 days of wages. Not 1 day, 18 days. Under these conditions, target practice, as we understand it today, standing at a range and firing dozens of rounds to maintain proficiency, was financially impossible for most working men. The men who could afford to shoot regularly were wealthy ranchers, professional gamblers, or men whose employment specifically required the skill and who were therefore supplied with ammunition. What this produced was a culture of what was called dry firing, practicing the draw, the stance, the trigger pull, and the hammer work using an unloaded weapon. Cowboys and lawmen would spend hours practicing the mechanics of drawing and firing without expending a single round. They would practice cocking the hammer, aligning the weapon, pressing the trigger. Everything except the expensive part. This explains something that has puzzled historians looking at documented accounts of actual gunfights. The miss rates were extraordinary. Men who were considered skilled shooters, men whose reputations had been built on their ability with a firearm, missed their intended targets at close range at rates that seem almost impossible to explain on technical grounds alone. The answer is that they had almost certainly practiced the mechanics of shooting far more than the act of shooting itself. They could draw cleanly and smoothly. They could cock and fire without fumbling. But the experience of managing recoil, accounting for the arc of a slow, heavy bullet, and keeping focus on a target that was shooting back, these were things that only live fire could teach. And live fire was something most of them could rarely afford. There is one more element of 19th century gunfighting that modern audiences never consider, because it was eliminated from the experience of shooting before most living people were born. Black powder smoke. Every firearm on the frontier, every revolver, every rifle, every shotgun was loaded with black powder, not the smokeless propellant used in modern ammunition. And black powder, when it burns, does not burn cleanly. It produces a thick, heavy, white to yellowish-gray cloud of acrid smoke that hangs in the air and does not disperse quickly. This is not a minor inconvenience. This is a fundamental transformation of the tactical environment. What actually happened in a gunfight? The first shot fired in an enclosed space, a saloon, a hotel corridor, a narrow alley between buildings, would produce a cloud of smoke that partially obscured the shooter's position and the target simultaneously. The second shot, from either party, added to that cloud. By the third or fourth exchange, participants in a serious gunfight were frequently shooting at shadows, muzzle flashes, or sound, rather than visible human targets. This is not speculation. Contemporary accounts of the gunfight at the OK Corral describe the space filling rapidly with smoke during the approximately 30 seconds the fight lasted. The alley where it occurred was narrow. The participants were close. The smoke had nowhere to go. Men who survived and gave testimony afterward described firing at shapes rather than people. This is why the miss rate in documented frontier gunfights is so high, even at close range. It is not primarily a matter of poor marksmanship, though that was a factor. It is a matter of the physical impossibility of accurately targeting something you cannot see clearly through a cloud of burning sulfur compounds. The first shot advantage. Understanding black powder smoke also clarifies something that experienced frontier gunfighters emphasized repeatedly in documented accounts: the overwhelming tactical importance of firing first and firing accurately. The first man to fire had a clear target. Every subsequent exchange happened in progressively degraded visibility. This is why frontier professionals consistently advised against rushing, not because they were relaxed or philosophically opposed to speed, but because a fast shot that missed created smoke in front of their own eyes, degraded their visibility for the follow-up, and told the other man exactly where they were. A slow, accurate first shot was worth more than 3 fast misses in every dimension. It damaged the target, it did not obscure your own vision, and it did not announce your position with a muzzle flash and smoke cloud before you had achieved anything useful. Black powder had a secondary problem beyond visibility. It left a thick, tarry residue in the barrel, cylinder, and action of the firearm after firing. A revolver that was not cleaned thoroughly after each use would begin to accumulate fouling in the cylinder gap, in the barrel, and in the timing mechanism. After approximately 20 to 30 rounds without cleaning, the cylinder would become difficult to rotate. After 50 rounds, some weapons would cease to function entirely. This meant that frontier men who carried firearms seriously spent far more time cleaning and maintaining their weapons than they spent firing them. The ritual of cleaning a revolver, disassembly, wiping the bore and cylinder with patches, applying oil, reassembly, was not a hobby. It was maintenance required to keep a potentially life-saving instrument functional. It also means that the image of a gunfighter firing dozens of rounds in an extended battle is largely fictional. In a real sustained engagement, black powder weapons needed to be cleaned between sessions of fire, or they began to fail. The dramatic extended gunfights of cinema would have produced weapons that stopped functioning long before the dramatic conclusion. We should address one more piece of the real picture before we close, something that sounds like a small technical detail, but actually reveals a great deal about how frontier men thought about their weapons. The standard practice was to load a 6-shot revolver with only 5 cartridges. The empty chamber was positioned under the hammer, the part of the mechanism that strikes the primer to fire the cartridge. This was not carelessness. It was not an oversight. It was a strict safety protocol followed by virtually every professional who carried a single-action revolver. The reason is the weapon's design. The Colt single-action army and similar revolvers of the period had what is called a hammer-mounted firing pin, a piece of steel attached directly to the hammer that, when the hammer was at rest, sat in direct contact with the primer of the chambered cartridge. There was no mechanical disconnect between the hammer at rest and the cartridge. If the hammer received a sharp impact, from a fall, from a bump against a saddle horn, from a sudden jar, it could fire the weapon. This was not a theoretical concern. Documented incidents include not just the Wyatt Earp saloon incident in 1876, but also a similar episode involving Sheriff John Behan in 1881, plus numerous entries in military quartermaster records documenting soldiers wounded or killed by their own revolvers falling from holsters or being struck against equipment. The loading ritual that experienced men followed was specific and invariable. Load 1 round, skip 1 chamber. Load 4 more rounds, lower the hammer carefully onto the empty chamber. 6-shot revolver, 5 rounds loaded, 1 empty chamber positioned to receive the resting hammer. 5 beans in the wheel was not a catchy phrase. It was a safety procedure that anyone who took self-preservation seriously followed without exception. The single-action revolver did have a half-cock notch, an intermediate hammer position intended as a safety catch, but experienced users considered it mechanically unreliable under field conditions. The half-cock notch was fragile, could be knocked out of engagement, and provided a false sense of security that the empty chamber simply did not. The real gunfighter of the Wild West frontier was not the figure in the cinema. He was a man working with expensive, imperfect, dangerous tools under conditions of profound practical limitation. He chose a shotgun over a revolver when he had any choice at all. He shot with one hand, partly from tradition and partly because putting his second hand near the cylinder was a reliable path to burned fingers. He stood sideways to minimize his profile. He did not aim at the sight picture. He pointed the weapon at the threat and hoped his instincts and his nerves held together long enough to connect. He practiced drawing without firing because ammunition cost 3 weeks of wages per 1,000 rounds. He worried about his gun going off by itself if he dropped it, so he left 1 chamber empty. He watched the smoke from his own weapon obscure his view of the man he was trying to hit. And when it was over, if he survived, he spent the next hour cleaning the black powder fouling out of his action before it hardened into something that would jam the mechanism the next time it mattered. That is the reality behind the mythology. It is not glamorous, but it is true. And at the Western Archive, true is the only thing we are interested in. Subscribe if you have not already. Leave a comment. Seriously, tell us which part of this episode changed your thinking the most. Share this with someone who still thinks they know what a real gunfight looked like. We will see you in the next one.